All right. Everybody have a good lunch? All right. What was the best part of the lunch? The asparagus. The asparagus was really good. Okay. See, we had something better than Chick-fil-A. Okay. Hey, just one clarifier. If you have questions that you want to ask for this afternoon, please put those at the end of the table. Kind of stack them up together and put them at the table, and we'll have people that will come and pick those up. Okay. All right. So our next speaker is Dr. Helen Harris. She is a licensed clinical social worker with more than 25 years of practice experience in foster care and adoptions, hospital and hospice social work, and grief therapy. Dr. Harris is an assistant professor in the Diana R. Garland School of Social Work at Baylor University, where she teaches in the physical and mental health sequence and does research in the area of grief and cognition. She is a woman who is passionate about her work, and you're about to be blessed. Dr. Helen Harris.
Thanks, Joe. Joe has a note that says 5 on it, and when he flashes it, that means there are 5 minutes left. So flash me soon, Joe. So how's it going for you guys? Yeah? Learning a lot, hearing a lot? Everything's building from one thing to the next, which is so reassuring and exciting. And I think if you don't leave inspired at the end of today, then you weren't paying attention. Okay? There's a story I use in my Lawson morning class called The Horse on the Dining Room Table. And it's a story about a guru who is a wise counselor that sits probably wrapped in some clothing on the top of a mountain. And someone climbs the mountain to see the great guru and says, "So tell me, O great guru, what is the secret of life and of death and of the meaning of death?" And the guru pauses a minute and says, "It's the horse on the dining room table." So the man leaves very dissatisfied because he has not heard what he wants to hear. And he experiences a few more years of life. And he goes to a dinner party one night. And when he gets to this dinner party, they go through the buffet line. And they go to the room where they're going to be eating. And on top of each table is a small horse, a real horse sitting on there. And he thinks, "Oh my gosh." And he looks around, and other people are not saying anything about it. And so he decides maybe I shouldn't say anything about it either, and he sits down, but he's trying to figure out where to put his plate. He doesn't really want his plate of food near a horse. And so he kind of holds it near his lap, and he eats awkwardly, and he wonders, why is nobody going to mention the horse? It's uncomfortable, it's awkward. Clearly, this is impacting our dinner and our life together, but nobody mentions it, and so he doesn't either. He's happy to leave at the end of the evening because he was so awkward and just so uncomfortable. And a few years later, he goes back to see the great guru and climbs the mountain again and says, "I still don't know the secret of life and of death, and why people don't talk about life and death and the things that are hard in life." And the guru says, "It's the horse on the dining room table. It's those things that are uncomfortable for us, and so we don't bring it up, and nobody else brings it up, and then it's never brought up. And it becomes so stigmatized, and we become so alone in our experience that we could be at a dining room table with people sharing the same awkward, uncomfortable, difficult experience and never have conversation about it." Well, the two of them visit a little bit, and the guru says, "It's late in the day. Wouldn't you like to have dinner with me?" And the guy thinks, well, I don't know what gurus eat for dinner, but let's give it a shot. So he stays, and they go into the tent, and there in the middle of the pallet where they're going to eat is a small horse. And the guru says, that horse need not bother us. And so they decided where they were going to sit, and they talked about the horse when they wanted to and didn't talk when they didn't want to about the horse, and had a good conversation and a good dinner. And the writer of the story says, when we're willing to name it, when we're willing to say what our shared experience is, when we're willing to not be afraid of the stigma, afraid of the discomfort, that everybody gets more comfortable, and we really are able to engage in conversation and relationships that are meaningful. And so I'm just grateful, Charlotte and Dudley and Katie and the rest of the family, for your willingness to partner with so many different sponsors and folks to say, we're willing to acknowledge the horse on the dining room table. And so in a way, that horse need not bother us. Not that it's not troublesome, but that it doesn't have to be awkward and uncomfortable. It doesn't have to be something that we try and avoid having conversation about. And we don't have to feel helpless and powerless anymore. Thank you, guys, for your willingness to make that happen. And for everybody of you that is in this room, how meaningful it is that there are people who will gather together and say, I want to know more about this. You've heard from a number of speakers this morning who've intimated and sometimes said, the truth is, we're probably here because either we've struggled with something or people who we love a lot struggle. And we want to be a part of acknowledging that and figuring out how to make this world a better place to be. So thank you for the investment of your time together and your commitment to honesty and healing. So here's a quick warning. I teach. That's my full-time livelihood when I'm not doing research and writing. And I love to give quizzes. Joe's already been doing that. You might have a teacher living inside you somewhere. So at the very end, after Joe flashes his 5-minute warning, I'm going to ask you to take a minute and write down 3 things. If you haven't already written a question, I'm going to ask you to write a question. Whether you turn it in or not, at least what you're hearing today from these speakers should be stimulating and inspiring more questions for you, because the more we learn, the more we need to know, and we know we need to know. Second, I want you to write down a hope or an encouragement, something that's you've gotten in touch with today that helps you feel more hopeful about whatever it was that brought you to our time together today. And third, I was struck when Amy gave us several lists of things that we can do. So third, I'd love for you to write down not one thing you can do, but one thing you will do as a result of what you've heard and said today. Okay? So that's the homework, and I'll remind you of that when I get flashed. That's pretty funny, right? I'm putting you on the spot, right? Wait till you go back to your church and tell people that you were flashing the speakers. That's right. Okay. All right. So we're going to do some things together. I want to tell you how cool this room is, because you guys don't know it, but everything you see there is right down here. So when it looks like I'm so smart and I can read out of the side of my head, it's not true. I can read right down there. So we're going to talk a little bit about the intersection of grief, which is my area of practice and research, and depression and suicide and some of the other mental health challenges that we've been talking about. Because I teach, I want to talk to you about a theoretical framework that I think gives some context for us to think not only about how we understand these concepts, but what we can do to make a difference. And not just theory to understand theory, but theory to be able to do something with it. So I'm wanting us to end with answering the big so what question. So now we know more, so what? And that's the purpose of your 3 questions as well, right? I really believe that our time will include some new grief research and information, some insights that I've gotten from one family who's been dealing with suicide and loss and depression and grief. Partly because I think when we name it and when we talk about it, it takes the power out of it. My hope is always that we'll not only examine information, but that we answer that so what question. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for those we love? What does it mean for those we serve? And that's how we'll be ending the session. The truth is, it is us. If I ask you to raise your hands today, which I won't, if I ask you, how many of you have experienced a depression in your life that's been diagnosed? A number of you would raise your hands, fair number. How many of you have experienced anxiety? A fair percent would raise your hands. When I ask you how many of you have experienced loss and grief, I imagine every one of you would raise your hands today. And so the reality is the things we've been talking about, the struggles that we identify as them, are all us. Sometimes us specifically, sometimes us as we interact with the people that we love and care about. You've already heard that as many as 25% of individuals will have a serious mental illness sometime in their lifetime. And Matt shared with you that only about half of those who are diagnosed with mental illness actually receive treatment. So what happens to all those folks? Those are the folks that we interact with on a daily basis and worry about until they come into some kind of crisis. And in crisis, the legal system becomes the mental health provider, which you heard Amy talk about just a bit ago. I think the reason that a lot of people don't receive treatment besides poor access to health care is also the stigma, our not having named it and not having said out loud, this is a part of who we all are and we don't have to be afraid of it. When people have diabetes or cancer or other physical illness, we name it and we respond. What we're learning about the brain, and now I'm into Matt's area way more, is that there is no mental illness that I'm aware of that's not physical illness as well. When we say mental illness is not physical illness, it's like we're saying the brain is not part of the body, right? I mean, yeah, it's all physical illness. So I'm not going to linger on this slide because you've already seen these statistics and the persistence of not only grief and depression and anxiety, sometimes undiagnosed and often untreated, but severe mental illness, as Amy was describing with folks who are dealing with psychotic episodes and times with breaks from reality and complete dysfunction. And part of what we know from the literature is when you've got one identified patient, at least 25 members of family and friends are seriously impacted by that as well. People hide their grief complications and their depression and anxiety often because of their concern that they'll be perceived as weak. I heard Matt say this morning, this is illness, it's not weakness. I can say that to you, and if you're thinking about somebody else, my hunch is you're internally saying, yeah, that's right, that's illness, it's not weakness. The challenge is when it's us, sometimes that paradigm shifts, and then we say, well, yeah, in them it's illness, but in me it's weakness. I should be able to overcome this, and we do the should thing, you know? And that makes us hide because we're afraid that our illness, our weakness, will be a burden for someone else. And the fact is that smaller problems are much easier to deal with than large problems. And the longer we hide and the longer that illness goes treated, the larger and more serious it becomes. And eventually, it does become crisis, both for the patient and for the family members and friends. So the consequences of hiding then become exacerbation. The consequences of minimizing or trying to make small a problem that's growing in its scope and nature actually create problems rather than solving them. Dan Siegel is a neuroscience physician who says that health is always a matter of differentiation and linkage. So we start with differentiating, and once we understand categories and criteria and how things are different and kind of tease out and are separate from one another, then it's important to take those pieces and be able to link them together and understand how the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Differentiation is something we do a lot in our culture. We talk about diagnostic categories. We have a manual that has a list of diagnoses for people, and that gets revised periodically, and then everybody scrambles around to learn what the new nomenclature and criteria are. But that really isn't about identifying what's wrong with people. It really is about developing common language so that we can talk about it. So one of the ways we differentiate grief from depression, from major depression, from bipolar disease, from other iterations of depressions, for example. The DSM-5 doesn't have a category for grief as being a DSM-5 pathological condition, and that's because normally grief is not something that requires psychiatric treatment. But to assume that grief doesn't require intentional long-term responses, I think, is a mistake. And so when we don't differentiate and we don't understand what we're dealing with and how we can respond, then unappreciated and unresponded to grief can grow into a depression. And there are times when grief that becomes depression becomes suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior. And times when suicide creates significant grief, which if unresponded to can become depression. So you can see how these pieces that are different actually get linked and stay linked to one another. The label and definitions have to do with criteria, often how many criteria, how severe the criteria are, over what period of time they exist, when does the sadness of grief cross the threshold to depression, why does that become suicidal thinking and action for some and not for others, lots of questions to answer. But we differentiate in order to have common language to talk about these. But when you go through the experience of losing a child to the disease called depression, you can wonder if you'll ever be okay again. Will life ever be all right again? Will life make sense again to me and to others? And you look inside and you find yourself looking back and trying to figure out what happened and what went wrong and what could have been different. You look inside for what could I be different, and you begin to look ahead and wonder if things can be different for the rest of your family from now on. Loss is, it's not just about death, it's about all the adjustment to changes that we have to make. And so the sadness and the longing that's normative also gets measured in many ways by how much people are having to recognize what's different today and what will be different tomorrow. So we talk a lot about that grief is not a loss that happens just at the time of death or at a move or whatever the change is, but it continues to happen at least for 1 year, all of 1 year after the loss. And when the grief is complicated by trauma or tragedy, that can be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, normatively. Think about this. If someone I care about, love, and am deeply engaged with, who I share all the major life events in my life with, is now gone, then that person's next birthday, my birthday, wedding anniversary, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Valentine's Day, first family reunion, first trip back to the cabin, first right? Those are all firsts without the person that I've shared that event with in the past. And those are losses all in their own right. And then milestones in life beyond that. What happens when my son would have been graduating from high school, when he would have been getting married, when his son would have been getting married and graduating. And those are all times when the memories and the absence of that person are happening to us inside. The question is whether we're having conversation about that and acknowledging it. And I think people really wonder if they should bring it up or not, because they don't want to hurt us. You know, should I mention it? Should I say his name? I was telling some of our students recently that I had a close friend whose son died when he was 9 with a terrible leukemia. And when he was 18, when he would have been 18, when my son was 18 and graduating from high school, I thought, what a momentous time this is for our son, who struggled a little bit in high school, to be actually graduating. We were excited about that. And then I thought, gosh, her son is not graduating and would be graduating at this time. Called her up and asked her to come to lunch, and we went to lunch together. And as we were sitting eating together, I said, you know, I want you to know I've been thinking about Joe and the fact that he would be graduating this year too, and wondering how you are. And she started crying, and I felt bad. I thought, oh no. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. And she said, oh, you don't understand. Nobody ever says his name. Nobody mentions him. He would have been he would be, and it's on my mind all the time. He wasn't my son, he is my son. He'll always be my son, and I think about these things, and if nobody brings it up, I think either they've forgotten or they're too uncomfortable, and so I don't bring it up. I said, yeah, but you're crying. And she said, yeah, I needed to do that, so thank you. Now, does everybody want us to make them cry? In every circumstance? No. So what I might have done is said, I've been thinking about bringing up your son. What do you think? No, she might have said. Or, yeah, can we talk about the fact that he would have been graduating? I think it's really important not to assume that everybody responds exactly the same way. And to give people choice about who they talk with and when they talk. But when we never mention it, when we don't write a card on birthdays and anniversaries, the anniversary of the death, when we don't give a phone call and say, you know, I was just thinking it might be a hard day for you and I wanted to touch base. When we don't do those things, we reinforce the stigma that, you know, this is something somehow that someone did something wrong, or it's too uncomfortable to talk about. And it makes people alone. Pardon me. I've been dealing with a bronchitis, but I'm not contagious. And besides, I'm far enough away from you that you wouldn't have to worry about it anyway. But I am going to take a sip of my tea periodically. So I visited with one family who've been willing to share their story and what they've learned and how that might help others. And when we begin to having differentiated a little bit that grief is not necessarily depression and that depression is not necessarily suicidal ideation, but that all three can be connected and can feed into one another. This is some of the linkage. A quote from this family. 6 months before our son died, one of his grandmothers passed away, who he was really close to. And I really felt like that was probably something that maybe triggered what was happening inside him. He didn't realize the impact it made on him. And I think when we look back, we realize now that that could have been something that impacted his depression. We know that one exacerbation of depression can be new grief and new loss, particularly loss that's tried to be managed as brave and strong instead of supported by one another. The metaphor that I share in my loss and mourning class is kind of this. There are physicians in the room. I don't know if it works. If it doesn't work, tell me afterwards so I never do this again, okay? But if I were to get out on one of these busy Dallas highways and try and cross, and somebody's car hit me, and I survived that, but I had a compound fracture in my leg, the bone's sticking out, and there's blood coming out, right? It's gruesome. How's your lunch working for you, right? And you come running over to me, and you say, "Oh, Helen, are you okay?" And I said, "Fine, I'm fine." You'd be like, she's not fine. She must have had a head injury too, right? So clearly, Helen, you're not fine. No, really, I'm fine. I'm fine. And I get up and I try and hobble, and you try and point out the reality to me. Helen, there's bone sticking out of your leg, and you're not fine. But I think I'll be fine. No, let me just I'll be fine. No, we're going to the ER. We're going to get some help, Helen. This requires some help. So you bundle me up and you put me in the car and you take me to the ER, and we get there, and it's not going to hurt anymore, right? Because I'm at the ER where things don't hurt. When they scrub the gravel out of that, and that's not going to hurt. And when they set that bone, that's not going to hurt. Or when they X-ray, to see how bad the break is, that's not going to hurt. All that's going to hurt, right? And then they're going to set the bone and stitch the gash and put a cast on and charge me a lot of money. and then I'm going to be well, right? Because I went to get help and now I'm well, right? Well, no. What I have now is support that holds the edges of the incision together and holds the bone in place. The healing that will happen happens naturally. It's God-given. It comes from the inside out. The bone will heal because my body has the capacity to bring calcium to that place and put it just where it needs to be. And my body has the capacity to make cells that look like a scar and hold that tissue together. And from now on, once that is healed and I can walk on that leg again, you'll always be able to tell that I had that injury, right? But once the healing has happened, that tissue is stronger than the tissue surrounding it that's never been wounded. And so the capacity we have when we've been wounded to heal from the inside out and to be stronger than we've ever been before is there. That is God-given, but we need support, things that hold things in place, the stability that gives us the strength we need for the healing to happen from the inside out. And the question is why we answer the question, "How are you?" with "fine" all the time. That may be the most compelling question. What is it in us that needs to say "I'm fine" rather than being able to say, "Well, actually, I'm hurting," which doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. The family also talked a little bit about generational trauma and how trauma sort of lives on from generation to generation. You look at my family, for example, we've had a lot of trauma. For example, my grandmother lost her husband. I lost my father as an MIA in World War I. And then her house burned to the ground, and all that happened within 12 months. And she was a single mom, and we had to be resilient and strong and suck it up and gut it up and deal with trauma and grief over years. And all that bottled up stuff becomes a part of the grief and depression picture, doesn't it? And then they said, "Our son's death has been hard on all the family, including his wife and son, including us, including his sister. But we're committed to our family and to others so that grief doesn't have to turn into depression. And depression doesn't have to turn into suicidal ideation, because we're willing to name it and talk about it and help one another." And we've talked about death as being loss. You're kidding me. That's a 5? Can't be true. All right, well, watch this, y'all. This is what happens with the Baylor professor when they're really in a hurry and they got a lot to say and they only have 5 minutes to do it. There are lots of kinds of losses that we have to deal with, and to recognize that people are losing relationships through divorce and through broken relationships and through moves, lots of losses that result in grief. One of the things that Matt mentioned this morning coincides, so watch me flip through these slides. Oh, this is really good. Okay, so Charles Core has a model of grief that he calls the domains of grief, and it's very similar to what Matt was talking about this morning, that there's an impact on relationships, which we call the social impact of grief, on cognition, on our physical health, our vulnerability to illness, and on us emotionally, which is what we tend to talk about the most, and then finally on us spiritually. The research that I've been doing is looking at what does it mean when people are grieving and experience cognitive impact. So, for example, I have a study with about 1,700 kids where we found an association between multiple losses in children, losses meaning death, divorce, incarceration, deployment of parents, and a diagnosis of ADHD. Because when kids have trouble concentrating and paying attention, when they're impulsive, when they're distracted, those are the diagnostic criteria. That's the differential language for ADHD, right? But those are also the primary symptoms for grief in children, cognitively. Do those kids really have ADHD? I think we need to find out, right? But what we know is they have grief, and if we can help them with their grief, and it doesn't exacerbate into some psychiatric condition, then we might be able to preserve their not having a psychiatric tattoo and taking medicine the rest of their lives. So that's some of the research we're doing. We met with 5 focus groups of senior adults over the past year and asked them to describe their experience with grief, and almost 100% described trouble with concentration and attention and memory. Those are some of the things you saw on Matt's slides this morning. So what does that mean? What does it mean that people experience grief, which can lead to depression and exacerbations beyond that? There are things we can do about it. We can start with saying, we'll name it. That it doesn't have to be a DSM-5 pathology to be worthy of our attention. That we've got to, as congregations and schools and organizations, recognize that grief doesn't end in 6 weeks just because we've gone on about our busy lives. That the whole first year is one loss after another. That we can name it, we can bring support around people and trust the healing that is God-given inside them to happen. And when it doesn't happen, in those cases when it doesn't happen, we can help people get to the help they need beyond what we're able to offer. But I think sometimes what we do is we decide that it's overwhelming and it's awkward and it's hard, and so we don't do what we can do. So that whole list that Amy gave you matters. Whether we're talking about grief, and by the way, there's a lot of grief when your mother has schizophrenia, right? And you're dealing with that in your family persistently. That we come alongside people and don't try and change the loss, the death, whatever's happened, that's out of our hands. We would be overwhelmed with that. But we provide for them the support, the stability that holds things in place so that their healing can happen. And that we can only provide that support when we're willing to name it, be honest, talk about it. I'm going to fast forward. See all this wonderful stuff you already got to hear? If you want the slides, I have a great bib for you as well. Just email me and I'll be happy to send it. So this slide has my contact information if you want to know more about the research, or you want the bib or the slides, just let me know. All right, what was your assignment? Number 1, write down a question. Number 2, a hope or encouragement, something that you can take away today that gives you hope and encouragement. Number 3, something not that you can do, but one thing that you will do as a consequence of having been here today. Last thing, I went to a conference a couple of summers ago, the Military Child Education Coalition. And one of the plenary speakers was a young guy in blue jeans and a t-shirt. It was great. He didn't have maybe he didn't have a suit, I don't know. But he had created an organization called I Promise. After his dad died, he was trying to think of a way to honor his father. And he thought the thing that was the most honorable about my father is that he was a man of his word. If he told you he was going to do something, you could count on it. And we don't have enough of that anymore, he said. So he created these little cards, these I Promise cards, and he put 10 at each table, and we all got to take 10 home with us. And he said, at some point, if you're going to make a commitment to somebody, I'm going to pray for you, or I'm going to do this thing for you, or I'm going to bring a meal once a week for the next 6 weeks, or I'm going to take you to your doctor visits, or that you write that commitment on that card. And you give the promise card to the person you're making the commitment to. And you tell them, when I fulfilled my commitment, you give me the card back. Hold me accountable. The one thing you write down today, this is one thing I take away from today that I can do. I urge you to promise and do. Thank you.
This is a very important topic. I know when I was going through this journey with my wife and her diagnosis, and I went through all this grief, and I had to take medication and really take care of myself so and really in having that support and people around you, it's what we call support is love. As the scripture says that love endures all things, and we come in with that love to help edify and build people up and help walk through the journey, not make them get through the journey. So, very important. Thank you, Helen. It was wonderful. All right, so, the questions? Yes, if you have your questions, we'll have people go around and pick those up. So make sure those are on your table. Okay. There's I have this group of guys that I meet with. It's kind of my men's group, and we talk about the word and truth and the good news. And I just, every time we talk about the good news, I have this phrase that I tell them, it just gets gooder and gooder. So the good news just gets gooder and gooder. So our next speaker, when she shares on this topic, it just gets gooder and gooder. So our next speaker is Kay Warren. She co-founded Saddleback Church with her husband, Rick Warren, in Lake Forest, California. She is a passionate Bible teacher and respected advocate for people living with mental illness, orphaned and vulnerable children, as well as those who are living with HIV and AIDS, where she founded Saddleback's HIV and AIDS initiative. Kay is the author of Choose Joy Because Happiness Isn't Enough. She also wrote Say Yes to God and is the co-author of Foundations, which is a popular systematic theology course used by churches worldwide. Kay and Rick are the wonderful parents of their children, Amy and Josh and Matthew, who is now in heaven. And she has 5 grandchildren. Kay shares deeply from an honest and genuine heart and a delightful hope. Please welcome Kay Warren.
Good morning. Oh, I'm on California time. It's morning to me still. I'm glad that you're here. It's really an honor to be with you. On July 18th, 1985, our third child, Matthew David Warren, was born, and he was a precious, if unexpected, bundle of joy, and he incorporated into our family really quickly. He was a very quiet, easy, non-demanding little baby, which was wonderful because I had had a very difficult pregnancy, so it was a blessing to have this easy little baby. But when he was about a year old, his personality began to change. And he became very hard to manage, increasingly negative mood. He felt things very intensely. We had to, as he grew into toddlerhood, we had to stop playing Candyland and those chutes and ladders because he would throw the game. Literally pick up the board and throw it. He just had quite a personality and quite a temper. And in preschool, he became aggressive and unhappy, just unable to rally him from unhappy moods, and his mood would change within seconds. And by the time he was 7 years old, he was diagnosed with clinical depression. We didn't even know children could be depressed. And then the diagnoses began to stack up: panic attacks, ADHD, early onset bipolar disorder by the time he was 11, major depression, suicidal ideation started when he was 12, OCD added to that list when he was in high school, and finally borderline personality disorder. That diagnosis came about a year and a half before his death. And as you can imagine, his life and our lives was a mix of doctor appointments, therapy, medications, school modifications, treatments. Eventually, it deteriorated into suicide attempts and hospitalizations. And then 2.5 years ago, the absolutely unthinkable happened. Our beautiful, creative, loving, compassionate, brilliant, wonderful son, brother, friend, nephew, uncle took his life. And his torture and torment were over, and ours exploded exponentially. The death of any loved one is a cause for deep grief, as we've talked about already today. And when that loved one is your child, there are layers of grief. And when that child also took his or her life, there are more layers of grief that are heaped onto the suffering. And when that family is also in the public eye, as we have been, and have had to do their grieving in a glass house, that grief can begin to feel like stacks of mattresses being layered on day after day. And the question that we have been asked so many times in these last 2.5 years is, how in the world are you getting through? How are you getting through this? And it's a question we've had to grapple with, and I've been asked to share it with you today. Some of you have lost someone already to a mental illness, addiction, suicide. There are all sorts of ways to die around mental illness. And some of you are living with that fear that someone you love is on the edge, and you're here today because you're desperately seeking for some answers, some hope, for somebody to tell you that it's going to get better, for somebody to tell you that you're not going to have to face some of these things. Some of you love somebody, you have a friend. You're here for a lot of different reasons. But one of the things that we all have to deal with in our lives, it may not be a death, it may not be a suicide, it may not even be mental illness, but somewhere there's something that's going to happen in your life that you're going to have to figure out how you're going to get through it. And so what I want to share with you is what we've learned specifically around our grief and then how we've used that. But it can be applied to any place in your life that you have the question, how am I going to get through this? So the first thing is 2 Corinthians 1, 3-11 is a passage of Scripture. You're going to see some passages and things here on the screen. But 2 Corinthians 1, 3-11 was a foundational passage for us as we were instantly confronted with how are we going to go on living after the death of our incredible son. Paul says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of all compassion, and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort others with the same comfort that we have received from God. For just as the sufferings of Christ flow over into our lives, so also through Christ our comfort overflows. If we're distressed," Paul says, "it's for your salvation. And if we're comforted, it's for your comfort." Listen to this sentence. "Our hope for you is firm because we know." We'll come back to that. "Because we know that just as you've shared in our sufferings, so also you will share in our comfort. We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the hardships we've suffered. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life itself. Indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death." Don't anybody ever let you tell you that mental illness is just spiritual. Here is Paul, one of the most godly men to ever walk the planet, who felt depression so deep he despaired of life. "But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us, and we have set our hope on him, that he will continue to deliver us as you help us by your prayers. Then many will give thanks to God for the gracious favor granted to us in answer to your many prayers. I want to really focus on that little phrase that Paul says, our hope is firm because of what we know. Regardless of what it is that you're going to go through in your life, what you've already gone through in your life, what we are currently going through, we are getting through because of what we know. Because there's some things that we know about God and that we have settled in our hearts. It's not because of even what we feel, but it's what we know. And there's 3 things I would tell you briefly that we know, and this is how we are able to get through. The first thing that we know is that life doesn't make sense. But we can have peace because we know that God is with us and he loves us. Have you noticed that life frequently doesn't make sense? Anybody willing to say that life frequently doesn't make? There are a few brave souls who are willing to say, yeah, life doesn't often make a lot of sense. We get confused, we're surprised, we don't know what's going, we can't figure out what's happened to us, we can't figure out what's happening to our loved ones, we just don't know what to do. We're in desperate situations, or we love somebody who's in a desperate situation, and you just don't know what to do. Isaiah 43:2, God promises, he says, when you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you pass through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned up. It will not consume you. In deep waters, it's our natural. I mean, I'm not a good swimmer. You put me in the middle of the deep water of a pool, and I instantly begin to flail. It doesn't matter what else I've been taught. It doesn't matter how many times I've been told, just, float or whatever. I flail. And I start grabbing and reaching out for something to give me stability, something to hold on to. And in those times when life is completely chaotic and does not make sense, in the death of our son, it just didn't make sense. Even though we knew he had been ill for so long, we were still able to have peace because we know that God loves us. We know that he is with us and he loves us. Hebrews 13:5 says, I will never leave you, Jesus said. I will never leave you, and I will never abandon you. When we're going through chaotic times, desperate times, we want explanations. We want to know why this is happening. We want to know what we can do about it. We want explanations. We want to figure things out. It's just part of our human nature. And the difficulty with that is God so infrequently gives us explanations. He so rarely gives us explanations for the things that happen to us in our lives. So how can you be at peace when you don't know what's happening or why it's happening? If God gave us an explanation for all the things that have happened in our lives, it wouldn't make it any different. For me, if I knew why Matthew died, it wouldn't bring him back. Explanations rarely give us comfort. What brings us comfort is God's presence. God has offered us his presence. He has not offered us his explanations. And so we know that he will never leave us, and he has not left us. So we can have peace as we've gone through the most terrible day of our lives, the most terrible thing that anybody could go through, because we know that God is with us. When we walked through the waters, he was with us, and he has promised to never leave us. The second thing that we know is that everything on earth is broken. But we can have joy because we know that God has a greater plan. When people ask us, how are you getting through the loss, the death of the suicide of your son? How can you have joy? We can have joy because we know that God has a greater plan. This perfect world that God made, that he described in Genesis, it didn't stay perfect very long. I mean, almost instantly, it was in a hot mess. Adam and Eve just wrecked it all for us. And if we had been there, we would have done exactly the same thing. So we can't get too mad at them. But the world is irreparably broken. Bodies are broken. Minds are broken. Relationships are broken. The weather is broken. What is all this El Nino stuff? I don't get it. I want the weather in California we used to have. We don't have it anymore. Everything is broken. The budget, the government, everything is broken. So how can we have joy? Isaiah 24:5 and 19 confirms how broken the world is. The Bible says there, the earth suffers for the sins of its people, for they have twisted the instructions of God, violated his laws, and broken his covenant. Therefore, the earth has broken down and has utterly collapsed. Everything is lost. abandoned and confused. If you ever read the paper or listen to the news or watch the internet and you think, man, this world is going to hell in the handbasket, you are so right. It truly is a broken planet that we live on. It is a broken place. So how can we experience joy? Because we know that God is good and that his purposes are greater than our problems. It's the only way to live on a broken planet, to live with broken relationships, to live with broken minds, to live with broken bodies, to live with a broken government. The only way to live with joy in this broken place is to know deep in your soul that God is good and that his purposes are even greater than the brokenness and the pain we experience. Romans 8:28, most of you know this verse. It's often been used as a weapon against people who hurt. And I'm sorry for any of you if Romans 8:28, but we know in all things that God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. If anybody has used Romans 8:28 to somehow make you stop hurting, stop grieving, stop feeling, I'm sorry. Because that's not at all what God is trying to convey here. God is trying to convey to us that his purposes are greater than the horrendous pain and suffering that we go through. It's meant to remind us that God is still good and that his purposes are going to prevail. It is not intended to be used as a weapon to tell you to stop feeling, to stop crying, to stop hurting. Doesn't say that everything's good because it's not. Matthew's death by suicide was not good. The losses that have occurred in your life, the ways that mental illness is a thief and a robber, those are not good. And anybody who says they are is mistaken. There is a lot in this world that is not good, but we know that God is working for the good, and we can trust that. Romans 5:3-5 says we can have joy even in our troubles, because we know that these troubles produce endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and this hope will not disappoint us because God has poured out his love to fill our hearts. It was mentioned, I wrote a book called Choose Joy about 4 or 5 years ago, and I wrote it because I've lived with a low level of depression my entire life. And as I read the scripture, I could see that joy was evident by some of those who wrote the Bible. I could see it in King David. I could see it in some of the biblical characters, clearly in Jesus, but in Paul and James. And I kept thinking, where am I missing it? Maybe it's just for a few people. Maybe that kind of joy is really for just a few people. Maybe I was standing behind the door when joy was handed out because I don't experience it very often. And I wrote Choose Joy as an attempt to try to figure out the gap between what I saw in the Bible and what I saw in my life and in the lives of most people that I encountered. Now, I'm not talking about the few extroverts who just have these happy, peppy personalities that I just want to slap sometimes. You're just too happy. Stop it. So I'm not talking about that. And if you think that's joy, you're mistaken. No, joy is what's present when the bottom falls out. Happiness is what's there when you've been to Six Flags over Texas, or you've been on a great shopping expedition, or you've just been fishing and caught, a fish this big. That's happiness. Joy is something different. Joy has to be there in the worst days, on the worst day of your life, or it's not joy. And so I began to search that out, and I'm forgetful. So I saw a necklace that said, Choose Joy, and I bought it, and I began to wear it because I need the tangible reminder that I can choose joy every day. And the day that Matthew passed away, I had a terrible sense of foreboding. His life had really deteriorated. He was suicidal. He was threatening suicide. He had attempted just 10 days before, been hospitalized, was out of the hospital. And I had a pretty good reason to believe that he had taken his life. Without going into the details, I was pretty sure that morning when I woke up that he was already gone. And so that morning when I got up, I deliberately walked over to my jewelry box and I pulled this necklace out of my jewelry box and I put it on. And the reason that I did, my heart pounding, my stomach heaving, not even really thinking clearly, but knowing that in some way by putting on a necklace that said, Choose Joy, I was arming myself for what I thought was going to unfold in that day. Later that day, as Rick and I waited at Matthew's house for the police to confirm what we dreaded, we're standing holding each other, weeping already, and I lifted it to him. I had even forgotten I had it on, and I kind of looked down and realized I had it on, and I lifted it up to him with no words. And instead of pushing me away and saying, "Are you nuts? Are you crazy? Get that thing out of my face. What are you doing? How can you say?" He took it and he embraced me deeper. And the only reason that we could do that in that moment is we waited for the news that we were so afraid we were going to hear. It's because of what we know. It is because of what we knew on April 5th, 2013. It's what I know today on October 31st, 2015. Is that, as the Bible says, we can have joy even in our deepest, darkest, most horrendous anguish moments, only because we have sent our spiritual roots deep into the love and the goodness of God for more than 50 years. We've both been believers since we were small children, and over these decades, we have intentionally sent our roots down into God's goodness, into God's love, into God's faithfulness, so that on the worst day of our lives, there was still something that we could call on. Verse 5 of Romans says, "And this hope will not disappoint us, because God has poured his love out to fill our hearts." But I would be a liar if I told you that hope wasn't difficult. Joy, I was able to access, but hope was crushed. So I want to talk to you a little bit about something else that we know. We know that we can have peace because God will never leave us and he is with us. We can have joy even in the darkest days because we know that God is good and he is still working. And we can have hope because we know there's more to the story. When Matthew's mental illness took a turn for the worst a few years before he died, I found myself increasingly frantic, feeling that his story was going to end in a way that I didn't want it to. And eventually I knew that I needed a stronger spiritual approach. I mean, I'm a believer, I'm a pastor's wife, blah, 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 all that. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough as I saw maybe something terrible unfolding ahead of us. And I enlisted a group of people to pray for us, to pray for our family, to pray confidentially. I asked people to send me scripture verses. I said, if God tells you a verse, would you please send it to me? And I began to go over and over those verses and those prayers that other people would send to me. And one friend saw this box in a store, and it says hope on it. And she gave it to me. And I began to take all of those verses that people sent me, those words of encouragement, those fragments of scripture, those prayers, and I would put them in my hope box. And every day, it became part of my quiet time. Every day, I would open my hope box, and I would read through the verses that God had given to other people and that God had given to me. And I went out onto this audacious faith limb with those verses, believing that God was going to heal Matthew. If he wasn't going to cure him outright, he was going to give him the tools to manage his illness, and that Matthew was going to walk in the land of the living again, and he was going to again sing his praises in the congregation of the fellowship of the body, and that he was going to live a life that had meaning and purpose to it. And I read those verses every day. I read them again the morning of April 5th as we waited, as I felt sure that there was something bad that was going to happen that day. I created a playlist of songs on my iPhone, and I put songs on there that gave me hope, that gave me faith, that built my confidence that God was at work. And sometimes they were quiet songs, because sometimes in the middle of the night I needed gentle songs. And sometimes I needed anthems, the great big songs that are big and bold, because sometimes I would scream them out at the devil. You can't have him. God is at work in his life, and I have hope and faith that God is going to save Matthew, that God is going to save his life, and he's going to heal his mind. And then April 5th, 2013 came, and Matthew died. And with his death, my hopes for a healed mind here on earth were crushed. And my playlist of songs that had kept me going through many a sleepless night, many a night of worry, that playlist seemed stupid. This box with the word hope on it, it's like it mocked me. Hope seemed like the most pointless, ridiculous thing I had ever invested in. Hope completely crushed me. And I didn't pick up the hope box for a month. I couldn't. And when I did, I opened it and I took the verses out. I thought I threw them away. Not because I didn't believe God, but those verses were not going to come true for my son. And I couldn't pray them any longer. A few months ago, I found them. Evidently, I stuck them somewhere else. I thought I threw them away. So what do you do when your hope is crushed? What do you do when hope doesn't turn out? You may not lose anybody to suicide. I pray that that never happens to you. But what will you do when the hopes that you have invested, when you've gone out on that faith limb for something in your life, what will you do when hope doesn't look the way that you thought it was supposed to? What will you do when hope is crushed? Well, I felt like I had a couple of options right off the start. One of them was to curse God, as Job's wife suggested, and call God a fake and a phony, to say that he had led me on, that he had defrauded me, that he'd given me all those verses and given me all that hope, and I was on this faith limb and believing him, and that God was a fake and a phony. That was one option. Another option was to take the guilt on myself and say, if I'd just been a better mother, if I had just been a better Christian, if I had just been a better woman, if I had had more faith, if I had done this, if I had done that, if I'd only believed this, if only I'd done that, if I'd paid attention to what this person said, if all those, it was me, that if I had been different or better, that Matthew would be alive. And over these 2 short years, I have decided that neither of those responses is helpful or true. Because the truth is, what I know about God prevents me from concluding that he is a fake and a phony and a tease. And what I know about myself and my own faith journey prevents me from concluding that it was my fault and that I didn't have enough faith and that I didn't believe enough. I know my faith. I know how strong it was. I know how vibrant and robust my faith was. There was not a failure on my part of faith, and there was no failure on God's part. And so what am I left with? Mystery. Mystery. A big, fat mystery. A friend who knows I'm very visual in my faith found this little Le Creuset brand. A lot of women probably know it. It's iron cast cookware, and it's supposed to be able to stand high temperatures. And Le Creuset in French actually means the crucible. And she said, Kay, your faith is in the crucible. You are walking through the crucible, and the questions that you have are immense. And I don't have any answers for them, but you need somewhere to put them. And I took all the questions, and I continue to write questions. And I put them in this mystery pot. They're the things like, why couldn't I save him? Why couldn't I? I talked him off the ledge hundreds of times. Why that day couldn't I talk him off the ledge? Why? Why? God, why didn't you intervene? You could have stopped him. Did he think about us in those last moments? All the torturous questions that are left, that I have no answers for. And they're in the pot of mystery. They're things that I don't know the answer to. And in that process, I'm rebuilding my faith. I'm rebuilding my hope, because my hope was crushed. But you can't live without hope. You have to have hope. You have to have a hope, or you cannot go on. And so I'm rebuilding my hope. For myself, I'm repopulating my iPhone, my playlist. It's Kay's Picks 2. The first was Kay's Picks. Kay's Picks I don't listen to, but Kay's Picks 2 I do. And it has songs that remind me that not for a moment, Meredith Andrews, not for a moment, did God abandon me? Did God abandon Matthew? In the moment Matthew pulled the trigger, God was still with him. And in the moment that his life on earth ceased, God and his angels were there and caught his falling body. He was not abandoned, not for a moment. And we have not been abandoned, even though there have been many moments in which it feels like we have. So I'm repopulating my playlist with songs that rebuild hope. I'm repopulating my hope box. I took out the ones that will not come true here on earth from my son. But I've begun to put verses in there that are certain hope, like 1 Corinthians 15:43, where God says, through Paul, these bodies of ours, they're buried in brokenness, but they will be raised in glory. They were buried in weakness, but they will be raised in strength. That is a certain hope for every person who has their faith in Jesus Christ. It has nothing to do with what I do or don't do. It hasn't anything to do with mental illness. It has nothing to do with suicide. It has nothing to do with tragedy. It has everything to do with who God is. And God has told me that because Matthew put his faith in Jesus as a little boy, even though he walked away from his faith as he felt God had abandoned him, God's salvation for Matthew was not based on anything other than that transaction between Jesus and him. And because of that, there's a certain hope. And when I stand over Matthew's grave, I'm a cemetery person. Who knew I was a cemetery person? I never knew that. It's kind of black humor, but morbid humor, but some of you would identify with that. So as I stand over my son's grave, I say every time to the watching spirit world who thought they had taken us out and that his story ended on April 5th, God is still working in Matthew's story. He's still working in our story. And so when I stand over his grave, I say every time, Matthew, your body, man, you destroyed it. My love, you destroyed it. It was buried in brokenness, but you will be raised in glory. Yes, you were buried in weakness, but you will be raised in strength. And that same truth is true for every one of us in our faith in Jesus Christ. No matter how you die, your body will be weak. It will be broken. But because of Jesus, it will be raised in glory. It will be raised in strength. That is a certain hope. And my hope box contains certain hope. One of my favorite quotes is from Eric Liddell, Olympic runner in the 1924 Munich Olympics. And he said, circumstances may appear to wreck our lives and God's plans, but God is not helpless among the ruins. God's love is still working. He comes in and takes the calamity and uses it victoriously, working out his wonderful plan of love. Our life has appeared ruined. Our life has appeared ruined beyond repair. As Helen said, there have been moments in which I thought, I don't know if I can even take another breath. But God is not helpless among the ruins. He's not helpless among our ruins. He's not helpless among your ruins. He's not going to be helpless when someday you face a ruination that you think right now you could not face, whatever it may be. It may have nothing to do with mental illness. It may have nothing to do with suicide, but there will be some circumstance in your life in which you are likely to feel, I am ruined, or we are ruined. And the fact is that God is not helpless in our ruins. He continues to work out our stories. The truth is, hope doesn't look the way I thought it would. And hope may not look the way that you thought it was going to, but hope is alive in me, stronger today than it ever has before. And that seems like the most ludicrous, ridiculous thing I could tell you, but I can tell you truthfully, I have more hope today than I have ever had before in my life. And if you are like me, and you're in a situation and you love someone who has a mental illness, or you are living with a mental illness, please don't stop praying those audacious prayers. Build your hope box. Put the verses and the encouragement in there that are about this life today and about what God can do. He's still the God who parted the Red Sea. He's not any different. The God who made the sun stand still, the God who parted the Red Sea, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, that God is still active in our lives. Go out on faith, limbs, and audaciously ask, boldly ask for healing of your mind. Ask for healing in your relationships. Ask for healing in the fractured places of your soul and in your family. Do it. Be audacious. Build your hope. And if you're like me and hope hasn't happened the way you thought it was going to, rebuild your hope. Rebuild it again, because you cannot live without hope. Have audacious faith that God will still continue to use your story. He can be trusted. 2 Corinthians 4, 8, and 9. Again, Paul, who I'm going to meet. Well, first, I'm hoping that Matthew and Jesus come together to meet me. That's my hope. I want Jesus and Matthew to be right there together. That would be my favorite hope. Because see, when I see Matthew the next time, he's going to meet me whole and in his right mind. And I hold on to that hope. So I hope Jesus and Matthew come together, and then I want to meet Paul, because Paul has inspired me so in my walk with Jesus. 2 Corinthians 4, 8, and 9, Paul says, we have troubles all around us. but we are not defeated. We do not know what to do, but we do not give up the hope of living. We are persecuted, but God does not leave us. We are hurt sometimes, but we are not destroyed. I can tell you honestly, we are devastated, but we are not destroyed. And you can make that same determination in your life that whatever happens, whatever already has happened, what may still happen, that you can not be destroyed by devastation. And we've begun to look for ways to use Matthew's story and our story to bring hope to others living with mental illness and their families, how to educate and equip churches to become warm and welcoming places where people living with mental illness feel safe, feel welcome, don't feel like they have to be ashamed. It was mentioned that I'm an advocate for people living with HIV and AIDS, and I am, and I have been for more than a decade. And as I've traveled the world, I have heard people whisper in my ear, I am HIV positive, or I have AIDS, because the stigma is so huge that here and around the world, most people still whisper that diagnosis. What I didn't know, what I didn't anticipate is that I have added now mental illness, mental health advocacy to what I do. I didn't anticipate that what I would hear now is people whisper in my ear, I have anxiety disorder, I have bipolar, I have schizophrenia, I have borderline personality disorder. Why do they whisper that to me? Because the stigma is huge, and the church is one of the places that the stigma is the greatest, and the church should be the first place to knock down the stigma where people can bring their whole selves. We're broken. We're all broken in just different ways. There is no shame. There is no shame in any illness, any struggle that we have, and the church should be the place. And so we are working pretty tirelessly to equip and educate pastors and church leaders and the larger faith community, because this is not a Christian issue. This is a human issue, and everybody in every part of the faith community needs to have a role to play. And we want to educate mental health professionals about suicide prevention. It's amazing what they don't know about suicide prevention. So what we have done, how we can have hope, how we are letting the story continue, is we just hosted a 3-day conference on mental illness in the church, the first part of this month. You could access it at hopeformentalhealth.com. You can watch it there. That we're changing the website in a week. It's going to be even better. You know how websites are. They're just pesky little things, and they just take forever. But our new one is coming up. But for now, you could access this entire conference, over 50 speakers, clinicians, researchers, people living with mental illness, families, folks from the government, advocates, all sorts of people are on that conference, and we're trying to use our influence in that way. We've tried to create some tools. We've created a toolbox that's called Hope for Mental Health Ministry Toolkit Starter. For some of you who have said, okay, I'd like to know what to do, I'm inspired, I want to do something else in our church, but I don't even have the faintest idea really how to begin. And so we have a toolkit. It's available at our table, and all sorts of stuff. My time is running down, but really what I want to leave you with is this. How can you use your story of mental illness, and for some of you, your story of loss and grief, to benefit other people? You can start by encouraging your church to start a ministry. Listen, if it doesn't happen in the church, this will never be solved. This will never be taken care of. It's not the government's job primarily. There's a role for government. It's not the medical community's responsibility. They have a part to play, but at the end of the day, it is the church. It is the church who is called to be the welcoming, embracing place where people bring their whole selves, where they find that they can make a contribution back. As Rick says, even a broken tree can bear beautiful fruit. So even those living with mental illness have a contribution to make in our churches. So encourage your church. If your church isn't interested and really just kind of, gives you the hand, NAMI's been mentioned. You can tell your story. Get on the internet, tell your story, call the news, do everything you can to tell your story. Tell it in schools, tell it in colleges, tell it in your workplace, tell it in your church, because people need to know that mental illness is a thief and a robber, and it takes so much from us, and we can give back. We can use our voices, especially the story of hope, especially the stories of hope in the middle of circumstances that appear to wreck our lives. When we tell people the stories that God is not helpless in the ruins, that He is still working out His plan of love in our lives, hope stays alive, and your story will become something that God will use in a powerful way. God bless you. Thank you for this time.
Okay. All right, we are now gonna have our Q&A time. So just give us 1 minute and maybe stand up, stretch for a second. We'll get situated for that. All right, if I could have okay, hello. All right, now I'm gonna be doing some beatbox, okay. If I could have our speakers come up. Okay, there's some more there.
You want me to kind of sort through?
You know you need to come up because I don't know.
Do them and I'll sort through those.
No, you have to come up here and sit.
I will.
You're the first question. Yeah, come on up, Helen. Yeah, she doesn't want to be the first one.
Yeah, I know. I was waiting.
Well, the women are here.
Yes, the women are here. All right, come on, Matt. Actually, the first question is here, so come on.
You asked them.
No, you don't have to.
Look how much there is. I know, but I have all these too.
All right, so here's what we did. We went through the questions that we had already. We tried to put them in as far as the same theme or the same type of questions. We don't have time to go through all the questions, but we'll try to get through as many as we can, and Matt's going to pick up some of the other questions here. So, okay, pretty enriching today, isn't it? Yes. Okay, so the first question actually is going to start with Dr. Matt here. You talked about earlier with the community transformation. And the question is, does your model include other gatekeepers outside the church?
Yes. Yes, we are. We're starting with church as a foundational point of the model, since people do go there first. But then we're also incorporating school districts and larger businesses Because what we want, basically the goal is to make mental health care accessible wherever you are. That's kind of the thought. So wherever you normally are, if you're at school, if you're at work, if you're at your faith community, wherever you are, that's where you can access the system. So yes, we will bring, in the 4th and 5th year, we'll bring larger businesses and school districts on board.
Anyone else? Nobody want to add anything?
Okay, so I just told you that we have a toolkit, and at our conference, we had, because we think there are 3 legs of the stool, that it really does take, it does take, there's a role for the government, and we need to encourage advocacy there. There's some laws that need to change. We think that business has a role. We think the private sector, we have a collaboration in our county between us and the local children's hospital, which had not a single pediatric inpatient psychiatric bed in a county of 3 million people. And so because of our challenge and our push, they're now doing a large expansion to now have pediatric inpatient beds in Orange County. So there is a role for that kind of collaboration in the community and the faith community. For us, because our largest platform is in the faith community, that's where we've put the majority of our efforts. But it really will take all of the aspects, all the players in society to really get traction on making things better for people with mental illness in the U.S.
Okay. All right, so the next question, this is Dr. Harris, and maybe Kay, you can respond to this as well. How do we start helping our pastors understand grief in a better way?
Yes. How was that? Well, let me affirm the question, first of all. I mean, I think it's an important one. I think we've got to be transparent with our pastors, that we've got to give our pastors the opportunity to respond by being honest with them about what we're dealing with. I think we've got to express what we need and know that and say to them, if you need us to help resource you, we can do that. The School of Social Work, the Grace Alliance, their Case Toolbox. There are lots of resources available for people. You all are in a position now where you know more about the resources that are available. So if we will speak to our pastors and say, this is a need, it's important to us, and if you haven't had that preparation and training and you're not certain what to do, there are resources available and we can help connect you with those.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing is pastors are in a very difficult position for many reasons, but one of them is that most of them feel very overwhelmed by what's on their plates. So, and when it comes to mental health issues, many of them feel like they're in over their heads, and many of them are. So when they hear, someone coming to them saying the church needs to do more for this, it's like, I cannot have one more thing on my plate, or it feels like the weight of the world on them. So I think the more we can, as people who understand, who've been there, who ourselves are equipped to do ministry in this area, the more we can come to them and offer what we have, rather than coming to them and asking them to add one more thing to their plates. I think it's a much more productive way to approach it, and say, we've got something to give. Will you come alongside, or put your support behind us so that we can do this ministry within the church?
Yeah, I just add to that we took a survey of our pastoral care. Can you guys see us? I didn't think so. Okay.
You can stand
All right.
up.
So we took a survey in our pastoral care team asking for them to kind of evaluate how much of their pastoral care duties were probably related in some way to mental illness. And we have a very mental health aware congregation. And so we came up with like 23%, and that was a conservative estimate, of the pastoral care calls that come in every day are in some way related to mental illness. And I think that what we're looking for is to be able to help pastors. We want to reframe it, because the fact is pastors are dealing with people living with mental illness every single day. They have the idea that this is one more thing to add to their plate, but what we want to reframe is to say, we want to help you do better what you're already doing. You are already counseling people who are living with mental, you may not recognize it, they may not know it, but you are dealing with people who have mental illness as a part of their story, a part of the situation that they're bringing to you. So far from asking you to add anything, we want to equip you to do what you are already doing in a much better way. That puts it in a positive light for them.
Yes, excellent. Okay, maybe, Amy, would you lead out on this question here? How should I come out with my mental illness?
Yeah, great question. I think, first of all, let me just affirm that it is important to be open about this as much as you can, not only for your own health, for your own sake, but also for the sake of the people who love you, and for the sake of other people who need to hear your story, because it's their story too. So the more we share our stories, the more we break down that sense of shame and stigma. So it is important to, quote unquote, come out. And that's what it can feel like. I mean, it's a big deal to start talking about this experience because there's so much shame and so much hiding. For me, I didn't start talking openly about my family's experience until just a few years ago. And I'm in my early 40s now. So it took a long time for me to come to this point, for me to actually write about it, to get up on stage and talk about it. I mean, this is a very recent thing in my life, and it's because I've done a ton of healing around this. But it's also because, my approach was without recognizing that I was taking an approach, was beginning to share with people who felt really safe. Just because I did try opening up to a couple people who didn't have compassionate responses. It was very painful. But some of the people I opened up to did respond to me compassionately, and the next time I saw them, treated me like they still liked me, which felt huge. So taking those baby steps of opening up to very safe people, and sharing, a little bit, and then maybe you share a little bit more, and as you experience support from the people around you, you gain more courage to share more widely and more openly. And it's amazing how when you begin to tell your story, I promise you, people will come to you with their stories, and it will completely change the way you feel about this experience. You are surrounded by other people who have similar experiences, and you don't know it until you start telling your own story.
Oh, no. Well, Helen, you can share on that.
I want to really reinforce the importance of evaluating who it's safe to come out to initially, because if you have a bad experience, it can be really tough to do it again. But you have some idea about who is safe and choose those people. I think also if you can start support groups in your church and support groups in your organization or wherever you find yourself, that in group there's support because there are lots of people who are sort of in the same boat, and that validation and that comfort level makes a big difference, and then you're not the only one coming out.
Okay, on this question here, maybe you can lead on this. How do I discuss or help someone with mental illness and they don't want any help?
Oh, that is the $64,000 question, because when I talk to families, as I do all the time now, that comes up probably 3/4 of the time. I love somebody who does not either want help or doesn't recognize that they are ill. And there's this great term that I always massacre when I try to say it. Anasagnosia. Yes, anasagnosia. Thank you. It's like a third of the people with depression and a half of the people with bipolar. It's a condition of the brain that is there because of the mental illness that makes them truly not understand that they are ill. Frequently, we think people who are don't say they're not ill, that they're resistant, that they're stubborn, that they're in denial, when frequently there's part of the mental illness that has actually affected their brain to the place that they don't understand that they are ill. They truly don't get it. And so when your loved one, particularly in schizophrenia, and they say, why would I take medication? There's nothing wrong with me. And you're always trying to get me to do this or that, and they truly don't understand. So at least be aware that that is out there, and it will change your perspective. There's a great book that has been really helpful. It's called I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help, by Amador, A-M-A-D-O-R. And he has this great approach to helping people who don't understand that they are ill, how you can become an ally of your loved one rather than an adversary. So I would first of all start with that. I mean, it's a long answer, but sometimes to come alongside somebody and try to help them. What are the goals for your life? What is it you would like to achieve? Okay, maybe you're not ill. Maybe you're not ill. Go ahead and just play the game. Maybe you're not ill. Maybe it's all me. So, but things don't seem to be working real well in your life. How could you think we could work together to help you accomplish what it is that you would like to accomplish for your life? And in that process, hopefully over time, as they begin to trust that you are not badgering them with how ill they are, how broken they are, how messed up they are, how they need this and that, and they don't see it, they don't get it, then you can come alongside as an ally. That's
great.
right there.
Anybody else on that one?
Add one thing, or maybe more, is that you don't have to control this person. You don't have to fix this person. You don't have to get them to do what you want them to do, although you may want to. But you also don't have to go along with their story. So if they believe they're perfectly normal, if they believe everybody else is wrong, it's everybody else who's messed up, whatever, they don't need to take medication, whatever story they're telling themselves, regardless of whether they're, just in denial or whether they actually really have no insight into their illness, you don't have to believe that story, and you don't have to pretend like you believe that story. So there can be a balance, in that middle ground between, being confrontive and being compliant with their story. You can just decide that, you're going to believe your own story. You're going to believe what you see and what you know they need. And that may make it more difficult to live with that person, but it'll make it, you'll be a lot healthier person for it. And ultimately, it may serve to help them because one of the things that they probably need is strong boundaries and is to run into those boundaries in the people around them, which can help people understand, okay, there is something in my life that is not working properly. So you can serve to help them even in that sense, in choosing to be a healthy person and choosing not to believe their story.
All right, now for our doctors. Okay, does depression lead to anxiety or vice versa?
That it really doesn't. Really isn't either of those. I always like to say depression and anxiety are kind of ugly step twins of one another. I mean, they go hand in hand. I mean, it's rare that you come across somebody who has depression that doesn't also struggle with significant anxiety, and the other way around also. So someone diagnosed with OCD will oftentimes struggle with a lot of depression, PTSD, a lot of depression. People with depression often have comorbid, co-occurring anxiety disorders. I mean, many of the medications that we use to treat depression are also used to treat anxiety disorders. So they go hand in hand. And a lot of times you don't realize that you have two different things going on because they kind of look the same. So you want to make sure that you talk to your physician and your therapist about both. Do you want me to try to answer some of these?
Well, did you have anything to add?
No, well said. I mean, that's right. It's a chicken and egg question, so I'm not sure it matters.
Right, yes.
I mean, just in terms of, you got to deal with what people are presenting to you, and
Okay.
that's right.
Well, and you also mentioned, you were talking about ADD and ADHD, and the question is, what is the percentage of ADD or ADHD that are later diagnosed as anxiety or depression? Do you have any statistics with those?
Yeah, I don't. The more likely, what we see is ADHD sort of comorbid a lot with oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorders, and so we see sometimes more issues with that later on. I think the big problem with ADHD is that a lot of things can look like ADHD, and so until we have a definitive physiological way to identify ADHD, then it's going to be tougher to differentiate and distinguish.
Right.
Yeah.
And Matt, ECT, is it good?
Electroconvulsive therapy, yes, it can be very effective, particularly for people who are medication non-responsive. It is used a lot more today as more of a first or a frontline treatment of depression. My personal opinion is I would not do that. I would try a regimen of medications before I did ECT. It does have some memory issues, although it can be extremely effective. It's being used also now for people with bipolar disorder, but you have to understand that that's only going to deal with the mood aspect, the depressive mood aspect. It won't deal with the mania. It also is being used with people with OCD. No, it's a safe procedure. You can't have some memory issues. It's a scary procedure. I mean, who wants to have electric current run through their head? And if you ask your doctor how it works, it is not uncommon for them to give you the terrible, it's kind of like turning your computer off and turning it back on, which is not really how I want my medical care described. So, and no, I mean, no joke. I've actually had clients that was how it was described to them by their doctor. That's just not real reassuring. So, yes, it is effective. If your loved one has depression and they've been taking medications for a year or two and had no relief, meaning they've been through a whole string of different medications in different classes and they really have not been able, no relief, then ECT is absolutely an option. And another one I would say to add on to that, a new FDA-approved treatment is transcranial magnetic stimulation of the prefrontal cortex. And that can be done right in the office. It's 2 large magnets that are put over the frontal cortex. You sit there, you can have a conversation. It's kind of like ECT with magnets, but it's not as invasive. And it has been FDA-approved. Clinical trials do show that it is effective for minimizing depressive symptoms. So you might check into that also.
Okay, I have 2 more questions, and then we can get through your list there. Kay, do you advocate within the LGBT community as well? We need you.
Absolutely. As I said, mental illness is in no respecter of persons. It is a human, it's part of our brokenness as human beings. And there is the stigma that folks in the LGBT community experience is profound and can get in the way of accessing services and telling people, if it's hard enough to tell, anything about your life and then to talk about mental illness as well, that can just compound a really difficult situation. So absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
Well, I'd just say one of the studies we're conducting right now are interviews with people who self-identify as Christian and as LGBT. And we've talked with a number of folks who've said that they've been told in their churches and other places that those are mutually exclusive categories. And the stories are full of pain and full of stigma and full of isolation. And probably the saddest thing that I've heard are the people who've said, I couldn't figure out how to change my sexuality, and so I changed my religion, or I changed my Christianity, or I walked away from God and the church. And that's very, very painful. I think we've got to be willing to love people, receive people, and understand that the gospel is full enough for all people, and stop marginalizing folks.
Okay, and you can start off on this one because I think this will get some passion here going, okay? So how do you respond to comments like depression and suicide is a spiritual problem, or you just enjoy being depressed?
Anybody enjoy being depressed? I'm still looking for that person. I've heard that.
Yes, I know.
Anybody like being really sad all the time? Really. That's seriously. But I've had people tell me that exact same thing.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Well, no, I get mad, okay? Because I also have a very similar question here on my wife's family thinks she has a demon instead of bipolar disorder, so it's very similar. All I would say is a couple of things. One is, if you certainly I believe in the demonic. Okay, I do, absolutely. And I believe in a personification of evil, Lucifer, the devil. I believe that he's out to thwart the people of God, okay? And have a PhD in neuroscience, so beat that, okay? But the thing is that, we don't say that to people that have cancer. We don't, now in the Bible, the demonic causes people to have all kinds of illnesses, boils and all kinds of physical ailments. God causes people to have rashes and all kind of terrible, but we never say that to people who have cancer. Have you ever had anybody say, I have cancer, and you go, wow, that's demonic, or that's what you thought? Could it be demonic? Sure, it could be. Do you pray for them against the demonic? Pray for me against the demonic. But if you pray for someone against the demonic, I don't mean in some kind of exorcistic, kind of like the movie or something, just like a Christian prays for another Christian. Why not do that for someone who has a mental health problem? And then also pursue, and then, God provides medication, he provides physicians. Luke he was a physician. He wrote 2 of the books of the Bible. I don't see anybody saying there was anything wrong with being a physician. So I think that that's a problem that we have. And it's really, it's an age-old problem. It's existed since the beginning of the church, in the early monastic hospitals where all of medical care began. People that had what were thought of as physical illnesses, like broken legs and things like that, they were treated humanely and cared for and nursed back to health. And people that were mad, people that had mental illness, they were punished in those hospitals because they were thought to have a spiritual deficiency. And we've brought that right into modern times. And so with the demon here, I don't believe, if you're a Christian, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and you've been born again, I don't believe you can have a demon. I think a demon can oppress you, but I don't think you can be possessed. I don't see how that's possible. So, if it's just, that's an easy cop-out to say to somebody. It's a self-righteous, that statement is a self-righteous. I mean, who would want to be depressed? Like, I've never met anybody, mentally ill people who I deal with constantly on a daily basis. And Joe can tell you this too, because we worked together for a long time. I have never seen people so desperately pursuing God. And, in essence, what you're saying is somehow they're broken, so God doesn't want to have anything to do with them, and that just doesn't sound like what's described there. So, I would say this. People are going to believe what they believe. If you want to believe that these things are spiritual, then please have at least consistent theology and believe that all things are, and I do believe all things have a spiritual base, but believe all illness is spiritual and pursue it spiritually. Our research shows that a high percentage of people that are told those types of things are also told by their churches and pastors that they should stop taking psychiatric medication. But those same churches also tell them that, oh yeah, it's fine to go to the doctor for your diabetes or whatever. That they're just really different types of things. And they're not. I think you've got an organ in your head. It's like I often tell Joe Hervey says before, I could hit you in the head with a hammer enough times that I could change your behavior. And that would be because I would damage the organ inside your head. And no one in here would say that was spiritual. They would say that's a traumatic brain injury. Well, you can be born with abnormalities in your brain. You can acquire abnormalities through trauma. These things can happen. We have to be smarter than that. We have to be smarter than that.
So if someone comes to you and they've had this experience that they've been told that you just like being depressed, you're just holding on to it, you're codependent with depression, or all these things, or you're demonic, what would be your message to them? How would you comfort them?
Well, gosh.
She would not get mad like I do.
Oh, no,
She's so
I would.
much nicer than I am.
No, I was trying to think of nice ways to say things.
I'm not nice anymore.
Yeah, I think that unfortunately, there's been a misunderstanding of what mental illness is through the centuries, and as Matt alluded to. And I think that pastors and church leaders have misunderstood the nature of mental illness, and so when it gets down to it, then people are told, and the same people would also tell you to pray harder, memorize more scripture, confess more sin, go to more Bible studies, et cetera, and which is just nonsense. As everything that Matt said, I heartily concur with. I think I would just to understand that we are whole beings, that there's teaching that needs to be out there, that we are whole beings, we are body and we are mind and we are soul, and things can get broken at every level within us. Something can happen spiritually, and it's going to affect you physically and emotionally. Something can happen to you emotionally. It's going to affect you spiritually and physically. And to understand, a really good friend of mine, Dr. Eric Johnson, explained to me about how that when things get broken on every level, it can affect your whole life. And conversely, when there is healing in one area, it can also have a positive benefit in the other aspects of your life. We are a whole, I guess is what I'm saying. And so when people talk to me about mental illness, I always try to encourage them to address it on every single level. Start with a physical. Get a complete physical. I always tell people, start with a complete physical. Have blood tests. There can be medical conditions that are causing depression, and that things that are easily, quote, fixable, that aren't necessarily mental illness. There could be a medication that's interacting. Get a complete physical. And then I say, make sure that you are working spiritually, because in every situation of your life, you need to grow closer to God. These are hard times. Grow spiritually. Do what you can to grow spiritually. Relationally, you may have some broken places in relationships. What can you do to mend them? Maybe you need therapy. There's some things. So we attack it on every single level. There's not any one level. Taking a pill isn't going to fix everything. Praying isn't going to fix everything. But in combination, there can be traction, there can be movement toward health in us as whole beings.
Right. No, absolutely. And I have a couple here that we have like so many questions up here, we're never going to get to all of them, so I just want to apologize for that. This is a question about addictions and mental illness, and basically wants to know the percentages, and it's probably close to low to mid 40% of people that have a substance use or alcohol problem also have a co-occurring mental illness. Okay, so in my work, if somebody comes to me with an addiction, I just assume they have a mental health problem in addition to that until I can figure out that they don't. So what you're looking at is probably somebody who's either adopted a very negative coping strategy to deal with their pain, or someone who is self-medicating to try to minimize their symptoms, okay? And so do realize that a lot of people that are addicts just, it's not, they can't just say no, like Nancy Reagan suggested to us to do. It's not that simple. You could have a serious underlying mental health problem, and people with bipolar disorder are notorious for having substance use problems on top of that. And these two questions that kind of go together. One wants to know what kind of legislation is needed to alter mental health treatment, and the other one is in relationship to insurance companies, so those kind of go together. I would say there's a couple of things that are really needed. Number one, we desperately need some kind of rider for HIPAA. HIPAA was put into place in 1996. It was mostly put in place because of AIDS and because of cancer, and that was to protect you so that nobody at your insurance company, no one at your business would find out about your health problems and then fire you or stigmatize you or mark you. But no one ever gave any thought to what that was going to do to people with mental illness, because what it now does is all the things we've talked about today, which is the person that's mentally ill now is responsible for all their care. They can't talk to you if you're the loved one, if the person is of age. And so we need some kind of rider that takes mental health into account and kind of separates it from the other illnesses. And for the insurance companies, I'll just say this, and I'll try to say this as non-political as I can, but the thing is that, we have to get away from all this, I was going to say, but I won't, so that we see on television with our politicians. This is killing people, okay? I mean, people are dying. So this like, no health care, people need to just get a job so they can people are dying out there every day, okay? So we need to have a real conversation about health care, generally health care, and we need to, in that conversation, talk about mental health care. Just this year, President Obama signed into effect a bill that had originally been started during the Bush administration to equate mental health care payments and non-mental health care payments, because insurance companies will not pay as much for mental health care as they do for other types of care. That went into effect this year and has had almost no effect because immediately insurance companies found loopholes and ways to get around it, okay? So the thing is that insurance company, there's nothing wrong with making money. I'm not saying that. There's nothing wrong with being an insurance company, and they have to make money. That's what they do. But the reality is that most of the people I deal with cannot afford mental health care, and their insurances don't cover enough of it for them to get better, and that's costing us billions of dollars and millions of lives. And we have to have a real conversation where we actually sit down, Democrats, Republicans, whatever you call yourself, and say, look, people are suffering, and we should be caring for one another. And again, I think that's where the church can really step up and say, it isn't a political issue, it's a care issue. Now granted, somebody has to pay for it, absolutely. I'm happy to pay taxes so that you can have mental health care. I'm happy to do that. You always hear that. People always say stuff like that, like if I knew what my money was, they were using my money the right way, I would be happy to pay my taxes if I knew someone was getting care from it. So we've got to, really have to have a real conversation that isn't all this political rhetoric. Now Helen's going to set me straight.
Well, the truth is we are paying for it.
Yes.
We're paying for it in the ER, and we're paying for it in the prison system and in the county jails. And Amy explained that to us this morning. And we're paying for it at the highest level of cost with the poorest results. We can do better.
In Texas, like Amy said, in Texas, the largest psychiatric facilities is the Harris County Jail. That's right. There is no close second. There's no close second. And Texas is arguably the worst state in mental health care delivery. We spend the most money of any state, and we provide the least amount of care. So we have just cut all of our community-based funding, and we are going to try to go back to institutions is what we're going to try to do. But they're not building any new institutions. So we're going to try to use the few state hospitals we have right now to cover this enormous burden that we already can't meet. And we're the state that everybody looks to as the one who did great in the economic kind of recession, and we're doing so great. But again, they're like the hidden ones that nobody talks about. You know, they're just a bunch of drunks and homeless people that just need to get a job. And criminals, right, because they're all in jail. So, if you really looked at it, it's frightening to see what we're doing. I mean, this is supposed to be a moral society, so it's really disturbing. You know, I go to Libya. Joe and I worked in Libya for a while with mental health care and in Africa. I mean, over there, it's not shocking if I tell you that, you know, people are brutalized and in some countries even killed for being mentally ill because they're looked at as bad omens and things like that. You would go, oh, well, I don't know that we're doing much better, frankly.
Okay, so I want to add to that. I mentioned I'm going to tell you books because I think there's so much out there. You need to read the book that's called American Psychosis. American Psychosis, How the Federal Government Destroyed the Mental Illness System in the United States, by E. Fuller Torrey. He's a psychiatrist, and you won't agree with everything, but I promise you it'll make you mad. And all the years and it's not political, so it's not a political thing. It's a factual recounting of what's happened in the United States. And all the years that Matthew was ill, and we had financial resources, and we still couldn't get him connected to the right places. And I walked away going, this thing is so broken. Why is it all so broken? But I couldn't tell you why it was broken. Once I read American Psychosis, I have a much better understanding of why it's broken. And it's broken so badly, I don't quite know how to fix it. But I'm telling you, if you really, really want to understand mental health care in the United States, it's an easy to read book. It's not like you have to have the PhD in brain stuff. It's for lay people like us who can
you know,
really access
the thing
it.
is money isn't going to fix it. It's not money that we need. That's the thing. Money's good, but we've thrown money at it for years, and that hasn't even changed anything. What we need is we need a change in the way we perceive it and the way we provide the services and care for people. So that's why, for instance, we're very interested in getting faith communities involved. Dr. Massey was very interested in getting primary care physicians. I mean, we have to rethink the system. The system does not work the way it is now. That's not to say there aren't great psychiatrists out there, great therapists, because there are. I refer to people all the time. But those are just individual resources. We have to rethink the system, and it's pretty disturbing if you have to deal with it every day. I mean, to see how many people suffer. I mean, as Kay said, I mean, they have resources. I've been working with a family for about 6 months now. It's a 30-year-old schizoaffective disorder daughter who they've been struggling with for years. I mean, I can honestly tell you, this family has so much money that you could never spend it in a lifetime. I mean, they are billionaires, and they have never been able to get care for their daughter effectively. They have unlimited resources. And so, and they just simply, if they can't get care, you just imagine somebody with very limited resources, what they have to do.
All right, great.
Fun. Hey, thanks for coming, y'all. So,
Hey, a round of applause for our speakers
but there
today.
is hope. There is hope.
All right, thank you guys.
There is hope.
Yes. Yes. All right. So just in closing for today, thank you everyone for coming today. I really appreciate, again, for Baylor Scott and White, the Capel District, what they're doing, Pastoral Counseling Center for the accreditation for today, and all our speakers and what they've brought to us today. And listen, there's a lot of frustration with this whole process with mental health, but events like this put us in a place where we can start building opportunities. We need to see this as an opportunity for change and bringing hope that lasts, okay? All right, so please visit the tables on the way out. If you, the presentations from today will be on the website, the Gil Taylor Depression Awareness Alliance, gtdaa.org. Give them about a week or so to get all the videos placed up on the website. And then, yes, we thank you for your attendance. We thank you for coming. And hopefully it's been very enriching. Have a safe trip home. Thank you.